that drink sitting in your hand right now once decided who lived and who died across an entire continent, and almost nobody knows why. It wasn't born as a drink of leisure. Its defining ingredient began as medicine because malaria was killing European soldiers across the tropics. Somewhere in South America, a bitter tree bark was about to change who could survive in the tropics and who could not. For centuries, Europeans avoided entire regions of the world, not because of armies, because something invisible was killing them by the thousands. That invisible killer had a name: malaria. For 200 years, nobody in Europe truly understood how to stop it from spreading. Then came a bitter, foul-tasting bark from the Andes Mountains, and everything about empire, conquest, and survival quietly began to change forever. This is not the story of a cocktail. This is the story of a molecule that made the impossible survivable and reshaped the map. Before it was ever poured over ice, it was measured in doses, rationed by doctors, and desperately needed by men who were dying. Every sip you take today carries the ghost of a trade, a quiet theft, and a man that history chose to forget. So how did a bitter, desperate medicine become one of the world's most recognizable drinks? The answer begins in the mountains of Peru. By the 1700s, European powers controlled fleets, armies, and gold. But there was one enemy none of them could defeat: the fever. In West Africa alone, European death rates from tropical fever were so catastrophic that the region earned a grim nickname among traders and soldiers. They called it the White Man's Grave. Not an official name, but a phrase whispered in fear across ports and trading posts. Entire expeditions collapsed before they truly began. Soldiers, missionaries, and merchants boarded ships knowing many of them would never come home again. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, indigenous healers in the Andes already understood something Europe hadn't discovered: a tree bark that fought the fever. The Quechua people had long used cinchona bark for medicinal purposes. Jesuit missionaries in Peru learned of its power and carried the secret home. By the 1600s, this Jesuits' bark was being shipped to Europe, sold at enormous prices to desperate patients who had no other option. For over a century, the plant grew almost exclusively in South America. Europe depended entirely on bark it could not grow, control, or replicate. That dependency was about to collide with something far bigger: the ambitions of empires, desperate to expand into the world's deadliest climates. In 1820, two French chemists finally isolated the active compound hidden inside the bark. They named it quinine, and medicine changed forever. For the first time, doctors could measure exact doses. Instead of guessing, quinine could now be refined, standardized, and shipped in controlled quantities. But there was a problem. The best cinchona trees still grew wild, scattered across remote slopes of the Andes, far from European hands. Harvesting bark meant carefully stripping trees that took years to mature. Supplies stayed slow, unreliable, and entirely outside European hands or control. As colonial ambitions grew in Africa and Asia, demand for quinine grew even faster, and South American nations began guarding their trees. Exporting live cinchona plants or seeds became restricted in parts of South America, protecting a resource European powers desperately wanted for themselves. That restriction created a new kind of race, not for gold or spices this time, but for something smaller: seeds and cuttings. European governments quietly began funding expeditions with a single, unglamorous mission: smuggle out the trees that Europe could not grow on its own. It sounds almost absurd, empires spending fortunes chasing tree bark, but quinine had become strategically vital to sustaining operations across malarial regions. By the mid-1800s, cinchona cultivation in places like Java had begun expanding rapidly, a shift that would eventually transform the world's supply. Quinine wasn't just medicine anymore. It was becoming strategically important because it made sustained European operations in deadly climates far more feasible. In 1865, a British trader named Charles Ledger set out on a mission that would change quinine production forever. But he couldn't do it alone. He needed someone who actually knew the mountains, the trees, and exactly which bark held the highest concentration of the precious compound. That someone was a Bolivian collector named Manuel Incra Mamani. History barely remembers his name, yet his work quietly changed the world. Mamani spent years identifying and gathering seeds from the finest cinchona trees in the region, knowledge no European expedition could easily replicate. The seeds he collected came from exceptionally quinine-rich cinchona trees, making them extraordinarily valuable for the Dutch plantations that followed across Java. Ledger shipped Mamani's seeds to Java, where Dutch planters began cultivating what would soon become the backbone of the world's quinine supply. But Mamani never saw the reward. Bolivian authorities, protecting their monopoly on cinchona exports, arrested him for what he had quietly done. In 1871, he was beaten in custody. He died shortly after, in poverty, while the seeds he risked everything for reshaped an industry overseas. The variety, later known through Ledger's name, became one of the most productive quinine-yielding cinchona trees ever cultivated, planted across colonial plantations. One man's knowledge, gathered at enormous personal cost, quietly became the foundation of a global medical supply chain he would never benefit from. Quinine alone was brutally bitter, nearly undrinkable on its own. Soldiers and colonists in the tropics needed a way to make it tolerable. Mixing the bitter powder with water, sugar, and lime became common practice among British officials stationed across malarial colonies in the 1800s. This wasn't a single dramatic invention. It evolved gradually, through trial, adaptation, and necessity, long before anyone simply called it tonic water. In 1858, the first patented tonic water appeared in Britain, followed soon after by Schweppes, which commercialized its own Indian tonic water recipe. Suddenly, quinine wasn't just a medical prescription. It was becoming a consumer product, sold in bottles, carried across the empire in crates. And somewhere along a colonial dinner table, someone made a simple, fateful decision: add gin. The bitterness softened. The medicine became a ritual. This wasn't an official military ration handed to every soldier. It was an informal habit that spread through colonial households and officers' clubs. What began as a way to choke down bitter medicine had quietly become something else entirely, a taste that would outlive the empire itself. By the mid-1800s, something remarkable was happening. Regions once considered entirely unsurvivable for Europeans were suddenly being explored, mapped, and slowly settled. In 1854, physician William Balfour Beatty led an expedition up the Niger River, using quinine as a preventive measure against the fever that had doomed earlier voyages. Earlier expeditions into the same region had suffered devastating losses to disease. Beatty's use of quinine marked a striking, closely documented shift. The expedition became an important demonstration that quinine could change survival odds in regions previously considered exceptionally dangerous for European travelers and military expeditions. Word spread quickly through colonial administrations. If quinine could protect an expedition on the Niger, it could protect soldiers, settlers, and officials elsewhere too. Colonial offices soon began stockpiling quinine as standard equipment for officials heading into remote tropical postings across Africa and parts of Asia. This wasn't magic. Quinine didn't prevent every death, but it dramatically shifted the odds. And those odds were exactly what empires needed. Quinine made longer-term European operations more practical in regions previously considered exceptionally darkness for sustained settlement, administration, military activity, and governance alike. The bark from a Bolivian mountainside, gathered by a man history nearly erased, was now quietly reshaping colonial strategy across 2 continents. But quinine's biggest impact wasn't about killing enemies. It was about removing one of empire's greatest natural obstacles: the human body itself. Historians studying this era are careful with their language, and for good reason. The full truth is more complicated than one simple molecule. Quinine did not single-handedly cause European powers to expand rapidly into Africa during the late 1800s. That expansion had many overlapping causes. What quinine did was remove one major biological constraint that had limited how deep, how long, and how safely Europeans could operate inland. Institutions studying this history describe quinine as an important tool in the control and expansion of empires, one factor among several in practice. Still, one factor among several undersells what changing survival odds meant for thousands of officials, soldiers, and settlers moving into new territory. Regions that once meant almost certain fever now meant manageable risk. That single shift altered who could govern, who could travel, and who could remain. Java's cinchona plantations became a major source of the world's quinine by the end of the 19th century, strengthening Dutch control over supply. A crop grown in Dutch colonial Indonesia from Bolivian trees, collected by a man who died for it, now powered empires across an ocean. Meanwhile, back in officers' clubs and colonial verandas, that same bitter compound was being poured, mixed, and quietly enjoyed as an evening ritual. The drink in your hand today still carries every ounce of that history, even if the ice and lime hide it completely. It's tempting to romanticize this story. Clever chemists, daring smugglers, a drink born from adventure. But romance erases the people who paid the real price. Manuel Incramamani never traveled to Java. He never saw a single plantation grown from the seeds he risked his life to gather. He wasn't the only local expert quietly written out of this history. Across colonial expeditions, indigenous knowledge was routinely extracted, credited elsewhere, and forgotten. The scientists who isolated quinine are remembered in textbooks. The colonial officials who cultivated it are remembered in plantation records. Mamani is barely remembered at all. This pattern repeats across colonial history. Expertise gathered from the very people empire displaced, then repackaged as a European scientific triumph for generations. None of this erases quinine's genuine medical importance, but it complicates any version of this story that sounds purely triumphant or purely accidental. The bitter liquid in modern glasses carries the memory of Andean forests, Bolivian mountainsides, and a supply chain built on unequal power. What changed wasn't the compound. What changed was the story people told about it, from desperate medicine to sophisticated evening ritual over time. Across tropical colonies, quinine quietly changed who could survive, travel, govern, and remain, reshaping the practical limits of empire for generations to come. By the early 1900s, quinine had become a routine precaution in many colonial administrations across Africa and South Asia, rather than a medical novelty. The plant that indigenous healers had used for centuries had become an industrial commodity, grown on plantations thousands of miles from where it began. Its modern image of leisure hides the imperial networks and human costs that helped make the drink and the empires it served possible. This is what makes the story so unsettling. Not a single villain, but a long chain of ordinary decisions that reshaped an entire continent's fate. Today, quinine still appears in tonic water, though in far smaller, purely flavoring amounts, nothing close to the medical doses once required. The bitterness you taste tonight is a faint echo of a compound that once determined who could survive entire regions of the world. A bitter medicine made tropical conquest more survivable, and that medicine eventually became the defining ingredient in a drink we now associate with leisure. Next time that glass is in your hand, look closer. Underneath the ice and the lime is a mountain, a molecule, and a forgotten man. So the next time someone hands you this drink, what other everyday object in your life might be hiding a history just as buried?